Every single day, you eat food without giving it much thought. You boil an egg, spread honey on toast, bite into an apple, and move on with your life. These are ordinary things. But behind every one of those ordinary actions is a story that most people have never heard. A story involving chemistry, history, biology, and sometimes genuinely surprising science that changes the way you see the food sitting in your kitchen right now. The food on your plate has been through more than you realize. Subscribe to Freud Mind and let us get into the secrets hiding in your food. Start with something that almost everyone eats, almost every day, without ever knowing much about it at all. The potato is one of the most important food crops in human history. Grown on every inhabited continent, eaten in virtually every culture on Earth, and responsible for feeding populations that might otherwise have faced starvation during critical periods of history. It is cheap, filling, nutritious, and extraordinarily versatile. Boiled, baked, fried, mashed, turned into starch, ground into flour, dehydrated for storage. Few foods offer as many possibilities from a single ingredient, but the potato had a genuinely difficult introduction to Europe. Potatoes originated in South America, in the Andean highlands of modern-day Peru and Bolivia, where indigenous peoples had cultivated them for thousands of years. Spanish explorers brought them back to Europe in the late 16th century, and for roughly 200 years, most of Europe wanted very little to do with them. People were suspicious. The potato was a strange, underground thing that grew in the dark, that was not mentioned in the Bible, that belonged to the nightshade plant family, which includes some genuinely toxic plants. And that did not look like any food Europeans were accustomed to. In some regions, potatoes were blamed for disease. In others, they were considered food fit only for animals. It took deliberate campaigns to change public opinion. Frederick the Great of Prussia reportedly ordered potatoes planted in royal fields, and then posted guards around them, knowing that people would assume something that required guarding must be valuable. The guards were instructed to look the other way if locals tried to steal some. The reverse psychology worked. Eventually, the potato's undeniable practical advantages won out. It produced more calories per acre than grain. It grew in soil that was not suitable for other crops. It could feed a family on a small plot of land, and it kept reasonably well through winter. By the 19th century, parts of Europe had become so dependent on the potato that when a disease destroyed the crop repeatedly in the 1840s, the results were catastrophic. The science of the potato holds its own interesting secrets. If you have ever noticed a potato turning green, that greenness is a warning. When potatoes are exposed to light, either sunlight or artificial light for extended periods, they produce chlorophyll, which turns the flesh green, and simultaneously increase production of a compound called solanine. Solanine is a natural defense chemical that the potato plant produces to discourage insects and other threats. In small amounts, it is harmless. In large amounts, it can cause nausea, headaches, and, in extreme cases, more serious symptoms. Properly stored potatoes, kept in a cool, dark place, stay well within safe levels. Few vegetables have a relationship with humans as old as the onion. Cultivated for at least 5,000 years, onions appear in ancient Egyptian records, in the writings of ancient Greece and Rome, and in culinary traditions on every inhabited continent. They are one of the most universal ingredients in human cooking, a foundation flavor in cuisines as different as French, Indian, Mexican, Chinese, and West African. When you cut an onion, you break open its cells. Inside those cells are sulfur-containing compounds that the onion has stored separately, along with enzymes that act on those compounds when they are released together. The cutting action brings these ingredients into contact and triggers a chemical reaction that produces a volatile sulfur compound, a gas that floats upward from the cut surface toward your face. When this gas reaches your eyes and mixes with the moisture there, it reacts to form a mild acid that irritates the sensitive membranes of your eyes. Your eyes respond by producing tears, Not emotional tears, but a biological response to irritation, trying to flush out the irritant. The onion is not trying to make you cry in any intentional sense. It is doing what it evolved to do, defending itself from being eaten. The sulfur compounds that cause eye irritation are part of a broader defense system. When an animal bites into an onion root, the sharp, pungent flavor and the chemical reaction it triggers are meant to be discouraging. There are practical ways to reduce the tears. Chilling the onion before cutting slows the chemical reaction and makes the volatile compounds less likely to become airborne rapidly. Cutting near a fan or ventilated area removes the gas before it reaches your eyes. Sharp knives cause less cell damage per cut, releasing less of the compounds into the air. None of these are complete solutions, but they all help. Not all onions make you cry equally. Sweeter onions, like Vidalia onions, tend to have lower concentrations of the sulfur compounds that cause irritation, which is part of why they taste milder. Yellow onions, with their higher sulfur content, are sharper in flavor and more aggressively tear-inducing. Red onions sit somewhere in between and have their own unique compounds that give them their distinctive color. Ancient civilizations valued onions for practical reasons beyond flavor. Onions have a relatively long shelf life compared to many vegetables. They are easy to grow and store, and they were used in various medical traditions. Egyptian workers who built the pyramids were reportedly provided with onions as part of their rations, suggesting they were considered a serious food staple, not a luxury. Salt is so ordinary now that it is hard to appreciate how extraordinary it once was. For most of human history, before refrigeration, before food preservation technology, salt was one of the most important substances on Earth. Not because it tasted good, but because of what it could do. Preserve food. Meat treated with salt could last for months rather than days. Fish salted and dried could be transported across continents and still be edible at the end of the journey. This made salt a technology, a way of converting perishable food into a storable commodity that enabled trade, exploration, and the survival of armies and populations through winters and long voyages. Salt was traded across vast distances in the ancient world. Routes were established specifically for its transport. Cities grew up around salt deposits and salt production sites. Wars were fought over access to reliable salt supplies. The word salary, what your employer pays you, comes from the Latin salarium, connected to salt, because in some historical periods Roman soldiers received allowances of salt or money to purchase it as part of their compensation. The phrase, "worth his salt," comes from the same tradition. The science of why salt preserves food is straightforward. Salt draws water out of food through osmosis, and without adequate moisture, most bacteria and molds cannot grow. This is why salted meat lasts and unsalted meat spoils. The salt creates an environment that most microorganisms cannot survive in. The same principle explains why salt is used in pickling, in curing fish, and in the preparation of preserved foods across virtually every culinary culture. In the body, sodium, the mineral in table salt, is essential for life. It regulates fluid balance, enables nerve signals to travel correctly, supports muscle function, including the beating of the heart, and maintains the pressure balance of blood. Neither too little nor too much is compatible with good health. The body maintains sodium levels within a tight range and has sophisticated systems for doing so. The widespread concern about excessive salt in modern diets reflects not that salt is inherently dangerous, but that modern processed foods contain it in quantities that the body's regulation systems were not designed for. Why does salt make food taste better? The mechanism is not fully understood but involves several interactions. Salt suppresses bitter flavors, which allows other flavors to become more prominent. It enhances certain aromatic compounds. It changes the texture of proteins in meat. And at low concentrations, it appears to directly enhance the perception of savory flavor in a way that is distinct from the taste of saltiness itself. Bananas are probably not something you think of as particularly surprising. Sweet, convenient, yellow, everywhere. They are one of the most universally familiar fruits on Earth. But they are hiding several things. Bananas produce ethylene gas as they ripen, a plant hormone that triggers ripening processes not just in the banana itself, but in fruits nearby. This is the real reason the old tip about putting fruit near bananas to ripen it faster works. The ethylene being released by the bananas is doing measurable chemical work on the surrounding fruit. Put an avocado next to ripe bananas, and the ethylene environment accelerates the avocado's ripening. The same logic works in commercial fruit distribution. Ethylene gas is used deliberately in shipping and storage to control the ripening of various fruits. The bananas most people eat worldwide belong to a single variety called the Cavendish. This was not always the case. Until the 1950s, the dominant commercial banana was a different variety called the Gros Michel, which was described by those who remember it as having a richer, creamier flavor than the Cavendish. The Gros Michel was effectively wiped out commercially by a fungal disease called Panama disease, which spread through banana plantations globally because the monoculture of a single variety offered no biological resistance. The Cavendish replaced it, partly because it was resistant to that particular strain of the fungus. This matters today because a different strain of Panama disease, called Tropical Race 4, is currently spreading through Cavendish plantations worldwide, threatening the same crop in the same way the previous disease destroyed the Gros Michel. The banana in your kitchen may look timeless and unchangeable, but it is actually a variety being raced against a disease that it may not survive in its current commercial form. Botanically, the banana is technically classified as a berry, a fruit that develops from a single flower with one ovary, whose entire wall becomes fleshy. By the same botanical definition, a strawberry is not a berry. Neither is a raspberry. But a watermelon, a pumpkin, and a tomato technically are. Botanical classification has its own logic, and it does not always match what the kitchen calls things. Honey is one of the most remarkable foods in the world for a simple reason. Properly stored honey essentially does not spoil. Honey found in ancient Egyptian tombs has been found to still be edible. This sounds like magic. It is actually chemistry. Honey has 3 properties that together make it inhospitable to the bacteria and molds that cause most foods to spoil. It has extremely low water content. Most honey is only about 17 to 20% water, far too dry for microorganisms to thrive. It is naturally acidic, with a pH of around 3.5 to 4.5, which most microbes find difficult to survive in. And bees produce an enzyme called glucose oxidase that, when honey is diluted slightly, produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide, a natural antimicrobial compound. These 3 factors working together create an environment where almost nothing harmful can grow. The process of making honey is a collective achievement. Worker bees collect nectar from flowers, a sugar-rich liquid, and carry it back to the hive. The nectar is passed between bees multiple times, and each transfer introduces bee enzymes that begin breaking down complex sugars into simpler ones. The bees then spread the nectar in thin layers across honeycomb cells and fan it with their wings, evaporating water until the moisture content drops low enough for the honey to be stable. The cell is then sealed with wax. The whole process is a sophisticated natural preservation system, refined over millions of years of bee evolution. Different flowers produce honey with distinctly different flavors, colors, and properties. Clover honey is mild and light. Buckwheat honey is dark and robust. Manuka honey from New Zealand has additional antimicrobial properties that have attracted medical research interest. The flower source determines the sugar composition, the aromatic compounds, and the trace minerals that give each honey its particular character. Eggs are one of those foods that seem completely simple and turn out to be surprisingly complex the moment you pay attention. The freshness test most people have heard of Placing an egg in water and seeing whether it sinks or floats works because of a genuinely interesting internal change. As an egg ages, moisture slowly evaporates through the thousands of tiny pores in the shell, and the air cell inside the egg grows larger to fill the space. A fresh egg has a small air cell and sinks because it is dense. An older egg has a larger air cell, making it less dense, and either tilts in the water or floats entirely. It is a reliable indicator of age, not necessarily of safety, since older eggs are not automatically unsafe, but of how much time has passed. The color of an egg's shell tells you almost nothing about its nutritional content or flavor. Shell color is determined by the breed of the hen. White-feathered hens with white earlobes tend to produce white eggs, and brown-feathered hens with red earlobes tend to produce brown eggs. The difference is purely genetic and has nothing to do with the diet, the treatment, or the quality of the egg inside. The price difference between white and brown eggs in many markets is essentially the result of consumer perception rather than nutritional reality. When you hard-boil an egg for too long, the yolk sometimes develops a gray-green ring around its outer surface. This is caused by a chemical reaction between the sulfur compounds in the egg white, which produce hydrogen sulfide when heated, and the iron in the yolk, which combine to form iron sulfide, a gray-green compound, at the surface where they meet. It is harmless, and it is purely a matter of cooking time and temperature. A properly timed boiled egg, quickly cooled in cold water, does not develop the ring. Chili peppers cause a burning sensation that is, in a biological sense, completely fake. Your mouth is not actually burning. Nothing hot is touching your tissue. But your brain cannot tell the difference, and it responds as if the burning is completely real. The compound responsible is capsaicin, the molecule that gives chili peppers their heat. Capsaicin activates specific pain receptors in your mouth and throat called TRPV1 receptors, which are the same receptors that respond to actual heat. When capsaicin binds to these receptors, it triggers the same signal to the brain that a genuinely hot substance would trigger. The brain interprets this as burning heat and responds accordingly, with pain signals, with increased saliva production, with the urge to drink something. The fact that no actual heat is present does not matter, because the signal is the same. In response to this pain signal, the brain also releases endorphins, natural compounds that reduce pain and produce a mild sense of pleasure or even euphoria. This is part of why some people enjoy very spicy food. The pain triggers a physiological reward response that, for some individuals, becomes genuinely pleasurable. Tolerance to capsaicin builds with regular exposure, as the TRPV1 receptors become temporarily desensitized, which is why experienced spicy food eaters can handle heat levels that would be overwhelming for someone with less exposure. Birds are essentially immune to capsaicin. They lack the specific receptor configuration that makes mammals sensitive to it. This is not an accident. Chili plants benefit from having birds eat their fruit and disperse their seeds, but not mammals, which tend to chew and destroy seeds. By making the fruit painfully hot for mammals and harmless for birds, the chili plant effectively selects its own seed dispersers. Chocolate melts in your mouth in a way that nothing else quite does, and this is not a coincidence. It is chemistry that is almost perfectly calibrated to human biology. Cocoa butter, the fat that makes up a large part of chocolate, has a melting point that sits just below human body temperature, around 34 to 36 degrees Celsius. This means that at room temperature, chocolate is solid. The moment it contacts the warmth of your mouth and tongue, it begins to melt, releasing flavor compounds, creating the smooth texture that makes chocolate so distinctive, and delivering those compounds directly to the taste receptors in an extremely efficient way. This is the mechanism behind why chocolate is so difficult to replicate with other fats. Substituting a different fat with a different melting point produces something that either melts too quickly or not at all. The same compounds in chocolate that are pleasurable for humans are potentially dangerous for dogs, because dogs process them far more slowly than humans do. What the human body metabolizes efficiently accumulates in a dog's system and can reach toxic levels from amounts that would be harmless to a person. This is not about size alone. It is about a fundamental difference in how certain enzymes work in different species. Chocolate was not always sweet. For most of its long history, it originated as a drink among Mesoamerican civilizations, consumed for thousands of years before European contact. It was bitter, often mixed with spices, chili, and other flavorings. The addition of sugar, the development of solid chocolate, and the refinement of the production process were all European innovations that turned an ancient bitter drink into one of the most popular sweet foods on Earth. Cut an apple and leave it on a plate for 10 minutes. The flesh will turn brown, not because it is rotting, not because something contaminated it, but because of a process called enzymatic browning that begins the moment the apple's cells are broken open. Apples contain an enzyme called polyphenol oxidase, which is stored separately from the compounds it acts on while the apple is intact. Cutting or biting the apple breaks the cell structure, bringing the enzyme into contact with oxygen in the air and with phenolic compounds in the apple's flesh. The reaction produces melanin, the same pigment responsible for the browning of skin in sunlight, and the apple flesh turns brown within minutes. The browning does not affect flavor significantly in the short term and does not indicate spoilage. It is simply a chemical reaction happening in plain sight. Lemon juice slows this process because the citric acid it contains lowers the pH of the apple surface, making it harder for the enzyme to function. This is why chefs brush cut apple slices with lemon juice to keep them looking fresh. Saltwater works for similar reasons, and some apple varieties have been specifically bred to have lower polyphenol oxidase activity, producing apples that brown more slowly than conventional varieties. Apples float in water because approximately 25% of their volume is air, trapped in spaces between cells. This is part of what makes apples crisp and gives them their characteristic texture when fresh. As apples age and cell structure breaks down, they lose this air and begin to feel floury or soft. The texture is literally the structure of the air pockets collapsing. Bread is one of the oldest deliberately produced foods in human history. There is archaeological evidence of bread making going back more than 14,000 years. For most of that time, before people understood the biology involved, making bread was a matter of experience and tradition. The science behind it was being performed by organisms too small to see. Yeast, a single-celled fungus that exists naturally in the environment, consumes the sugars in flour and produces carbon dioxide gas as a byproduct. This gas, trapped within the network of gluten proteins that form when flour and water are mixed and kneaded, creates bubbles throughout the dough. The dough rises because it is being inflated from within by billions of tiny organisms producing gas. When the bread goes into the oven, the heat kills the yeast, but the structure the gas created is set by the cooking process, producing the open, airy texture of good bread. The crust and the extraordinary smell of fresh bread both come from a different reaction entirely. When bread is baked at high heat, the sugars and proteins on the surface undergo a complex series of chemical reactions, called the Maillard reaction, that produce hundreds of aromatic compounds simultaneously, including many that are responsible for what we experience as the smell of baked bread. This smell is not one thing. It is a mixture of hundreds of volatile compounds, each contributing to the overall impression of warmth, freshness, and comfort that makes fresh bread one of the most universally appealing smells that exists. Bread goes stale not because it dries out, but because its internal structure changes. The starch molecules in baked bread slowly rearrange themselves over time into a more crystalline structure, a process called retrogradation. which makes the bread feel harder and denser even when it still contains moisture. This is why bread that has gone stale can be refreshed by warming it. Heat temporarily reverses the retrogradation, making the starch feel softer again before the process resumes on cooling. The food in your kitchen is not what it seems. It is the product of thousands of years of cultivation, commerce, chemistry, and biology. Each item carrying a history and a science that most people eat through without ever thinking about. Every meal is a tiny world of extraordinary things happening invisibly, built on millennia of human discovery and adaptation. The next time you are in the kitchen, give it a second look. The stories are all there, hiding in plain sight. Like and subscribe to Freud Mind. There is plenty more where this came from.